first video deals with conversions, whether it's a fraction to a decimal to a fraction to percent, or any way you want to look at it. So this is going to teach you how to do conversions. So first we're going to do a fraction to a decimal. And the rule states to get a fraction to a decimal, you actually want to divide your numerator, which is our top number, by our denominator, which is the bottom number. And a lot of people, when they first start off, they actually get it a little wrong. So if we have the fraction 1/2, it is actually, when we say divide our numerator by the denominator, the 1 is the one that actually goes inside, and we can call it going inside the house, and 2 goes on the outside. And an easy way to just help you remember is if you go ahead and put that over top of your numerator to help remind you that's what goes on the inside. So your first step is to ask yourself, how many times will 2 go into 1? Well, that answer's 0. However, I still need to see what it is as a decimal, so I need to take it a step farther and ask myself, well, what can I add to this that's not going to change the number? Well, I can add a decimal and 0 because I still have the number 1. I'm going to move the decimal up, and now I can ask myself, how many times does 2 go into 10? Well, that answer is 5, and 2 times 5 gives me 10, no remainder, so 1/2 converted to a decimal is 0.5. Let's look at one that's going to be a little bit more work. If I had 3/7, so I would need to say 3 divided by 7. To remember that, because 3 goes inside, I'm going to go ahead and do that for myself as a visual reminder. And then I'm going to go ahead and start solving. Well, 7 goes into 3 0 times, but I can add a decimal and a 0 and bring my decimal up, make it a little bit larger. And I can keep going now. So I ask myself, well, how many times does 7 go into 30? And this is without going over and as close as possible. Well, I know that 7 times 4 is 28, and that's going to get me closest without going over. And 30 minus 28 is 2. 7 does not go into 2, but I can add another 0, bring that 0 down, and I can keep going. You want to keep going until you get 0, or you notice that it repeats. So then I say, well, how many times will 7 go into 20 without going over? Well, that's going to be 2, and 7 times 2 gives me 14, gives me 6. 7 will not go into 6, so I need to add another 0, bring it down, and I ask myself, well, how many times does 7 go into 60? And this is maybe when you need to start thinking of your multiplication facts. Well, I know that 7 times 8 is 56, so that's going to get me close. It's going to be an 8. Bring down the 56. That's going to give me a 4. It's not repeated yet, and it's not a 0 yet, so I've got to keep going. Add on another 0. Bring that 0 down. How many times will 7 go into 40 without going over? Well, I know that 7 times 5 gives me 35. And 40 minus 35 gives me 5. I'm going to bring it over here because I ran out of room. Haven't had a 5 yet. So I haven't had anything that repeats. So I need to add another 0. And I would have brought it down. So it goes right here. And I ask myself, how many times will 7 go into 50? Well, I know that it can't be 8, because 7 times 8 gives me 56. So let me go 1 down, so that's 7. 7 times 7 is 49. 50 minus 49 is 1. Still haven't had anything repeat yet. So I would add another 0 and bring that 0 down. And ask myself, how many times does 7 go into 10? That's 1. And 7 times 1 gives me 7. 10 minus 7 is 3. At this point, I can see that it repeats because I've got remainder of 3. And I started with 3, and that wouldn't work. So to show that it's going to repeat, you have that bar all the way across it, and you do have it for all the numbers, because it's going to continue to be 0.428571, 428571, 428571. And instead of constantly working it out, because you'd be working for the rest of your life, you can just show the bar, which means that it repeats. And again, it goes over all of the numbers because all of those numbers will repeat. Okay, so let's now look if we had a decimal and we wanted to change it to a percent. So if we have the number 0.25 and we want to change that to a percent. Well, what we're going to need to do is we're going to want to rewrite it so that we can show all of our work. And the rule for that states that you're going to take your decimal and move it 2 places to the right. Some people like to think of Dr. Pepper when they do this because it's decimal to a percent, right 2 times, and that means that the decimal will be moved right twice. So once, twice, so we can rewrite that, 25, and then your final step would just be to add a percent sign. So let's look at 2.57. Our first step is to just rewrite it so we can show all of our work. And we need to move our decimal 2 times to the right. 1, 2. So that's actually 257%. And yes, it's more than 1, but that's because we started off with a whole number, so that's okay. Okay, let's see. Our next one's going to be a percent to a fraction. Percent to fraction means that you want to take it and put it over 100, because percent means per 100. So if we had 170%, we would want to show our steps, so we would take the percent of 170 and we'd put it over 100. And then, quite frankly, you really want to reduce it. So you need to look for a common factor. Well, if they both end in 0 and the number's not 0, that means that 10 is a common factor. So I'm going to pull out a 10 with both of them. And 170 divided by 10 is 17. 100 divided by 10 is 10. And now, other than 1, 17/10 does not share a common factor. And you can leave it as an improper fraction. You don't need to change it to a mixed number. That's absolutely okay to have. Okay, so let's look if we had 27.3%. So we want to rewrite it as the 27.3 over 100. And if you have a decimal right there, just go ahead and leave it. Don't worry about trying to find a common factor. And so that's how you would turn that percent into a fraction. Okay? Let's see how to change a, how about a fraction to a percent? And so we want fraction to percent. Well, your first step is to actually take on the steps and turn it into a decimal. So that means that the 2 goes on the inside. Five goes into 2 0 times. I need to add a decimal and a 0, bring the decimal up. And 5 will go into 24 times, and it goes in evenly. So I have 0.4, and then now I get to my rules, and I take the decimal, and I turn that into a percent. So I'm going to rewrite it. And the rule for a decimal to a percent is I take my decimal, and I move it 2 places to the left. And since there's no number there, it's understood that it would have the value of 0. So that is going to be 40%. So 2/5 converted to a percent will be 40%. And let's look at, so convert a decimal to scientific notation. Decimal is the same thing as it being in standard form. So let's look at, so we want to take the decimal and we want to write it into scientific notation. Scientific notation says that we have one factor that will be equal to or lesser, or equal to or greater than 1 but less than 10. So it's got to be between 1.0 and 9.9 is how we can rewrite our first factor. That is not written like that, so 0.73. We would need to get it between the 7 and the 3 so that the first factor would be 7.3, and that is in between the numbers that we need. So we will have 7.3, it's going to be times 10 to a factor. Well, we moved it one time, so it's going to be times 10 to the 1, and we took a smaller number and we made it larger, so it's actually going to be to the negative 1. Because 10 to the negative 1 is 1/10, and if we take 7.3 and we multiply it by 1/10, you'll get 0.73 again. What if you had, if your decimal was 6.52? You say, well, that's already how my first factor needs to appear. So that just means that you're going to multiply it by 10 to the 0 because you don't need to move the decimal. Okay?